is a story called Bereft. June 16th was the first time we saw Mr. Baker since his wife's funeral. Matt and I were sitting on our patio eating ice cream in the last 20 minutes of the lingering sunset. Staring with our spoons in midair, we watched him carry 2 stuffed garbage bags down the stairs with a strength and swiftness that defied his age. With a groan, he heaved the bags into the dumpster, and panting, returned up the stairs with his eyes set straight ahead of him. I shouted a hello when he reached his door, but received no response, other than a short pause before he twisted the handle and slammed himself shut again. The next night was a continuous replay of this scene. For 2 months, we hadn't seen any signs of life from apartment 14B, and suddenly its door was in constant motion. It released Mr. Baker, loaded with sacking bags, and allowed him back empty-handed, swallowing and spitting him out every half hour. By the time we left for work the following morning, the dumpster was buried under a cover of shiny black, punctured where items' edges fought against the plastic. Matt and I waited for at least 2 minutes, stealing furtive glances at Mr. Baker's window, before scurrying to a pile of trash like starved rats. I gently kicked a few bags, praying that nothing would feel like a dismembered body part. With a stab of courage, Matt ripped open a particularly bulging sack. "Is it drugs?" I whispered, though no one was near us. "Don't touch anything that looks illegal. Leave it for the police." Matt shot me a look that told me how ridiculous I sounded, before pulling out a handful of cassette tapes. "I doubt they're laced with LSD," he said. He dug deeper into his bag, pulling out photo albums of blundered sweaters. I found that the one at my feet contained mostly dish towels and books, with an umbrella stuffed in the middle. Random and often broken, the contents of the few bags we opened relieved my fears about living next to an axe murderer. But something about that odd collection, junk, necessities, and treasures, all hurriedly thrown together, looked scared. Mr. Baker had been rather reclusive ever since Matt and I had met him a year ago. We moved in with all 12 of our cardboard boxes that screamed "just married." We never got more than a stiff nod or a brief comment about the weather if we asked him how he was doing. His wife was a different case. With her unkempt mane, colorful shawls, and dangling bracelets that reflected the sun no matter how cloudy it was, Mariah looked like she still belonged to a 1960s folk band, her gray hair and wrinkles the only signs that any time had passed. She loved talking, too. She told stories, delightful ones, about the youthful days that still clung to her long skirts. The first time we met, I was struggling with the assembly instructions of our new patio chairs, and she was watering a miserable-looking potted plant. She asked how we were settling in, and 20 minutes later, we were drinking some chai she brought out, chatting about where to buy the best blueberries. "You have to go down to Gilbert County, worth every minute of the drive," she told me. "And there's the prettiest swimming hole half a mile from the stand. We used to spend every warm Saturday swimming and eating blueberries. And we'd sing. Always make time to sing." She closed her eyes and began humming softly, and I liked her immediately. The next couple of months passed in much the same way, Mariah telling me stories while I glanced over the paper, and she tended to her various herbs and the Charlie Brown plant, as Matt called it. I heard about the collie she loved as a child, the dance where she met her husband, the time she saw Billy Joel in an airport. One day she gave me a plan of my own, the small beginnings of a petunia in a temporary plastic container. "Thought it was about time you joined me," she'd said, going on to tell me exactly how often to water it and when to transfer it to a more permanent home. After that, I'd obsess over my flower while she watered hers every evening. The day I put it in a blue clay pot was when she told me about her cancer. I noticed her hair growing thinner, but hadn't let myself think about it too much. "Is the treatment working?" I asked. "We'll see." She made her way over to the Charlie Brown pot. "Why do you keep that?" I had been wondering and wanted to change the subject. "It's my favorite," she cooed, laughing when she saw the confusion lines on my forehead. "Remember when I told you that Frank and I spent a lot of time on the road? Well, one day, we packed up the station wagon and set off for a full year, sleeping in the car or a tent. We explored every nook and cranny of the South." I shook my head. Of course Mariah would have done something like that. "We like to go to flea markets, more for the people than the treasures," she continued. "And one day I came back with this little guy." She smiled at her plant like it were a newborn baby. "Got it for free. Frank made fun of me for the rest of the week and told me to get rid of it. But I was stubborn and kept taking care of it every time we stopped. Has it ever bloomed or looked, green? I asked. Nope, Mariah said with a smile. But I think that sticking with me for 30 years is enough of a miracle to ask from it. By the end of the summer, Mariah wore long scarves wrapped around her head. They suited her, always bright colors and tied in a way that let the ends fly in the wind like her hair used to. I didn't see her watering her plants as often, and a few more of the delicate-looking herbs died. But I saw her leave for her treatments every couple of days as Matt and I headed off for work. She'd smile and try to begin a conversation, but her husband would help her into the car and shut the door before they got beyond a hello. I grew to resent him for that. On an afternoon in October, the day before the first frost, she came out while I was reading on the porch. Her face looked paler than I remembered, but the same smile stretched across it when she saw me. "Gotta get my survivor in from the cold," she explained, pointing at the pathetic plant. I asked how she was doing, and she did her best to sound cheerful, explaining that the treatments made her tired, so she didn't get out much. At that moment, her husband stuck his head out the door, glaring at me for a few seconds before muttering something about Mariah coming in soon. He disappeared back into the apartment like an aging turtle into his shell. "He wasn't always like that," Mariah whispered apologetically, glancing behind her at the closed door. "He used to love people, and laughing. He could laugh." She smiled at the memory, but it faded a second later. That was my grave was long and life was easier. She tugged at the ends of her scarf. It was purple today and made her look like a medieval queen. She sniffed and lifted up the flea market plant. "Well, I better get inside. Doctors told me to rest." I didn't see Mariah for 5 months, and I missed her. Matt would watch me pause at our door and stare at hers. "Why don't you call her?" he'd ask. "Take her a pie or something." But I didn't want to intrude or face her husband or see her sitting in the bed to which she was now confined. Finally, on the first warm Saturday morning in March, she emerged, looking like a shade come back from the underworld. Holding the plant as she had the day she disappeared, her arms shook under the small weight. I jumped up from where I was sitting on the patio to help and took the pot from her. I started to ask how she was, but as she lifted her head, my voice caught in my throat. I didn't dare ask how she felt. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely, and shuffled back inside. She died in her sleep that Tuesday. The funeral was small, about 20 people on the side of the river where they scattered her ashes. Mr. Baker didn't cry, only stared at the water. A well-meaning lady who had worked with Mariah made the mistake of saying something about being in a better place and seeing her again one day. Mr. Baker turned his head toward her, the rest of him a statue, and for a second I was afraid he was going to hit the poor woman, right there in front of the priest who performed the service. But instead his lips twisted into an unnatural smile. "Forgive me," he told her in a voice half sugar, half acid. "But I don't believe in heaven. Most of us in hell don't." It was the most I'd ever heard him say. For some reason, those words played on repeat in my head the evening of our dumpster dive as I watered Mariah's plant. When Mr. Baker had dropped off the face of the earth after the funeral, I took the chore upon myself. Matt probably thought I was crazy, but he never said anything and let me grieve in my own strange way. Usually I simply watered the plant and scurried off Mr. Baker's property before he could notice. But after the trash bags, I was too curious and leaned toward the window, peering through the open blinds. All the lights were off, but the sunset streaked through, revealing an empty living room. If I hadn't seen Mr. Baker the day before, I would have thought he moved out. The door next to me burst open and I jumped, the water from my pitcher flying in the air and landing on Mr. Baker. I froze. "What are you doing?" he demanded. My mouth was too dry to form words, so I pointed at the pot in front of me, my face turning a deep crimson, coloring me guilty. His eyes fell on the plant and stayed there for at least a minute. "Stop it," he said. His voice was firm, but shaking. A week passed and the plant didn't receive a drop of water. It was so desperate looking before that the neglect didn't appear to do much damage, though. Another week went by. It still stood as pitiful as ever. Every day to and from work, I would pause long enough to check if it were still alive, and then dart it away, thrilled but not wanting Mr. Baker to catch me. I saw him go outside and examine the pot a few times, touching the soil and then standing with his shoulders pulled back, as if he were about to have a Western-style standoff with a piece of vegetation. The beginning of July brought a thunderstorm that knocked out the power in half the city, but not Mariah's ugly treasure. Mr. Baker began checking on the plant at least 3 times a day, no longer getting any closer than a few feet away where he paced nervously. As we sat in our kitchen one night, we heard a crash and a husky growl from the outside of our apartment. The crash came again and sounded like a piece of china shattering on the dining room floor. Matt went to the window. We thought the trash bags were bad, he said. I stood next to him and to my horror saw Mr. Baker on his knees, sweating and snarling. He held a hammer in his clasped hands and raised it above his head before slamming it back down onto the broken remnants of a clay pot. I dreaded going to work the next morning. Maybe another black garbage bag had already taken the poor plant to its final resting place. Or maybe Mr. Baker hadn't bothered to clean it up, leaving the debris on his balcony as a mark of victory. It was gone or ruined, and I wasn't sure which one I feared more. Finally, Matt went outside first to let me know what to expect. "Come look," he called, not sounding nearly as devastated as I thought he should. I made myself leave the apartment, though I kept my face down. As I walked straight ahead, Matt caught my hand. "Look," he insisted. I inhaled deeply, reminding myself it was only a stupid plant and that my emotional stability should not depend on something so meaningless. I looked. Before me lay the broken flower pot, soil strewn all over Mr. Baker's porch. But in the midst of the bits of clay and clods of dirt stood that pathetic little plant, its roots somehow wrapped between the wooden planks of the floor. The leaves looked as withered as ever, the stalks still more brown than green. There it stood, with one addition. The tiny beginnings of a red bloom stretched toward the rising sun. I heard a scratch in Mr. Baker's window and looked up. 2 eyes stared out of the dark apartment between the blinds, terrified by what they might be witnessing.